The paper slid across the glass coffee table and came to rest an inch from my husband's coffee cup. On the left, a pawn shop redemption receipt, $1,200, paid in full, my signature at the bottom in the same steady hand I use for everything I don't intend to revisit twice. On the right, an official police incident report. Grand larceny. Case number stamped in the corner and officer's badge number beneath it. My mother-in-law was standing by the window, arms crossed over her chest in a way that might have looked defiant if her face hadn't already gone the particular shade of pale that comes right before someone realizes the ground they've been standing on isn't there anymore. "You reimburse every cent it took to buy back my daughter's heirloom," I said, looking at my husband, not at her. "Or your mother explains to the officer waiting outside why her thumbprint is on a pawn ticket for stolen property. Choose right now." Nobody said anything for a long moment. I could hear the hallway clock ticking, the specific, ordinary sound of a house that had, 3 days earlier, still felt like somewhere I trusted. I want to take you back to where this actually started. Because by the time those 2 pieces of paper hit that table, I'd already stopped being anyone's peacekeeper. My mother played that violin for 30 years before she ever let anyone else touch it. She wasn't a professional. She taught high school orchestra for most of her career, which is its own kind of professional, I suppose. Just not the kind that comes with recital halls and applause. But that violin, an antique she'd inherited from her own grandfather, handcrafted, warm-toned in a way that even I, someone with no real ear for music, could recognize the moment she drew the bow across it. That violin was the closest thing my mother had to a second voice. She played it at Christmas. She played it once at my wedding, something slow and unshowy that made half the room quietly cry without quite understanding why. When she passed 4 years ago now, the will was specific in a way that surprised even me at the time. The violin wasn't left to me. It was left directly to Lily, who was 6 years old when her grandmother died and has grown up since then understanding, in the particular unquestioning way children understand things that adults have to work harder to accept, that the violin in the closet was hers, and it was sacred, and it connected her to somebody she'd loved and lost too early. Lily started lessons the year she turned 7. Not because I pushed her, because she asked, unprompted, standing in front of the closed case one afternoon, saying she wanted to learn to play it the way Grandma used to. She practices every single day now, 20 minutes minimum, sometimes an hour if she's working through something difficult, standing in her room with the case open on her bed and the instrument tucked under her chin with a seriousness that still, 3 years in, catches me off guard sometimes when I pass her door. I had it appraised the year after my mother passed, mostly for insurance purposes. The same practical impulse that makes you photograph things you hope you'll never need photographs of. The appraiser spent almost an hour with it, checking the maker's mark inside the F-hole, the grain of the wood, details I didn't fully understand but which visibly excited him in a way that told me this wasn't an ordinary instrument. "This is a serious piece," he told me. "Handcrafted, this age, this condition, I'd insure it north of $10,000. Possibly higher if you ever had it independently authenticated further." I didn't tell my husband's family the number. I didn't tell most people the number. It felt much like the china in a story I'd once read online and thought vaguely, how horrible, glad that's not my life. It felt irrelevant to what the violin actually was, which had nothing to do with dollars and everything to do with my daughter standing in a doorway 3 years earlier, asking to learn to play the instrument that still, faintly, smelled like her grandmother's house. My mother-in-law, Brenda, operated on a very simple hierarchy, one I understood clearly within about 6 months of marrying into the family and spent the following 9 years hoping, foolishly, might eventually shift. At the top of that hierarchy sat her son Tyler, 26 years old, chronically between jobs, perpetually one bad week away from a full-blown crisis that somehow always required someone else's money to resolve. Beneath Tyler sat, roughly in order, my husband, herself, and then somewhere near the very bottom, everyone else in the family who wasn't Tyler, including, apparently, her own 10-year-old granddaughter. I'd watched this hierarchy in action for years in smaller ways. Birthday gifts that mysteriously became loans to Tyler. Family dinners where Tyler's latest setback got 45 minutes of concerned discussion, while Lily's violin recital, which had happened the same week, got a single distracted, "That's nice, honey." I'd learned the hard way that raising it directly with Brenda accomplished nothing except making myself the villain of the conversation for having the audacity to notice. I never imagined it would go as far as it did. I want to be honest about that. I assumed wrongly that whatever entitlement Brenda carried toward money and attention had some kind of floor to it, some line even she wouldn't cross. I found out exactly where that floor actually was on a Thursday afternoon in June, coming home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital dead tired, looking forward to nothing more complicated than dinner and a shower. I heard Lily before I saw her. Crying, the specific broken kind of crying that doesn't stop when a door opens, that keeps going because the person doing it has stopped being aware of an audience. She was curled up on her bed, and the closet door behind her stood open, the small shelf where the violin case usually sat completely bare. "Baby, what happened?" I dropped my bag in the hallway and crossed to her in maybe 3 steps, my whole body already running on the particular adrenaline that arrives the instant you register your child in genuine distress. "It's gone," she managed between sobs. "Grandma's violin, it's gone. I looked everywhere, it's just gone." I found Brenda in the kitchen 4 minutes later, calmly making herself a cup of tea, entirely unbothered by the sound of her granddaughter sobbing 2 rooms away. "Brenda, where is Lily's violin?" She didn't even flinch. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Months later, she didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't show a single flicker of the shame a normal person would show getting caught doing something this cruel. She just set her mug down and looked at me with something close to irritation, like I was the one being unreasonable. I took it to the pawn shop downtown. Tyler needed help with his beach house deposit. The poor thing is so stressed. He needed this trip badly, and I wasn't about to let him lose the reservation over a few $100s. "You pawned my daughter's violin. It's an old fiddle in a closet, for God's sake. She's 10. She doesn't need some expensive antique to learn Twinkle Twinkle." Tyler is a grown man carrying real stress. He needed this more than she needs music lessons. I don't fully remember what I said back to her in that first minute. I remember the roaring in my ears, the specific quality of rage that arrives so completely it briefly makes you stupid with it. What I do remember clearly is my husband walking in partway through, hearing enough to understand what had happened, and instead of turning immediately toward his mother, turning toward me first. Okay, let's not blow this up into something huge. I'll just order Lily a new violin online tonight, a nice one she won't even. It's not about having a violin, Mark. It's about having that violin. The one your mother stole from a 10-year-old to fund your brother's vacation. She's just trying to help Tyler, she didn't mean. She meant it enough to walk into our house, into our daughter's room and take it, I said. There's no version of that where she didn't mean it. Brenda, to her credit, if you can call it that, didn't even bother pretending otherwise. She stood there sipping her tea while her granddaughter cried down the hall, entirely certain, I think, that whatever storm this caused would blow over the way every previous storm involving Tyler had blown over. That Mark would smooth it, that I would eventually let it go, the way I always had. I looked at both of them for a long moment. Mark, already halfway into damage control mode on his mother's behalf instead of his daughter's. Brenda, unbothered, sipping tea like she'd done nothing more consequential than borrow a cup of sugar. I didn't say anything else to either of them. I walked upstairs, unlocked the file cabinet in my home office, and pulled out the folder I'd kept there since my mother's estate closed. The original purchase documentation my mother had preserved for decades, the notarized will naming Lily as sole beneficiary of the violin, the appraisal from 4 years earlier. Then I got my keys, and I drove straight to the police station. Behind me, I could still hear Lily crying through the closed bedroom door. I intended that to be the last time anyone in that house ever made my daughter cry over something that was rightfully hers. Officer Vance had the kind of steady, unhurried patience that made filling out a police report feel less like an interrogation and more like being carefully, thoroughly heard, which, after an afternoon of being told by my own husband not to blow things out of proportion, was its own small mercy. "Walk me through the ownership," he said, and I laid the folder open on the desk between us. My mother's original bill of sale, decades old, the ink faded but legible. The notarized will, the paragraph naming Lily specifically by name as sole beneficiary of the instrument. The appraisal from 4 years back, complete with photographs, serial details from the maker's mark, an insured value just north of $10,000. He read through all of it without rushing, occasionally jotting something on his intake form. "This is about as clean as ownership documentation gets," he said eventually. "Explicit bequest to a named minor, appraisal on file, no ambiguity about who this instrument belongs to. If it's been pawned by someone other than the legal owner or her guardian, that's grand larceny, full stop. Value alone puts it well past petty theft thresholds. She's my daughter's grandmother, my mother-in-law. Doesn't matter whose grandmother she is," he said, not unkindly. "Property law doesn't have a family discount." I gave him what I knew: Brenda's full name, her general description, the fact that she'd mentioned the pawn shop downtown without further specifics, which in a city our size still narrowed things down to exactly 3 locations. He ran her name through the system while I sat there, and within a few minutes had a hit. A pawn transaction 2 days prior, downtown location, an antique violin logged in the description field, a small cash amount that made something in my chest tighten with fresh anger. She'd pawned a $10,000 heirloom for less than $1,500, a fraction of what it was actually worth, purely for the speed of the cash. "I can have an officer meet you there within the hour," Vance said. "Given the documentation, this should move fast. Pawn shops are required by law to hold onto items and cooperate with police recovery when there's a valid ownership dispute backed by this kind of paperwork. I'd like to go now," I said, "if that's possible." He looked at me for a moment, not skeptically, more like he was recalibrating how much urgency this particular case actually carried, and deciding I wasn't overstating it. "Let's go now," he said. The pawn shop sat between a nail salon and a check-cashing storefront, fluorescent lit. The kind of place that smells faintly of dust and old electronics no matter how clean it actually is. The owner, a heavy-set man in his 50s who introduced himself as Ron, went visibly tense the moment Officer Vance walked in beside me. Badge visible, tone professional but unmistakably official. "We're here regarding a transaction from 2 days ago," Vance said. "Antique violin, brought in by a woman matching this description." He read Brenda's details off his notepad. "We have documentation establishing the item as stolen property belonging to a minor. I'll need you to pull the item and the transaction paperwork." Ron didn't argue, which I appreciated more than I expected to. He disappeared into the back for a few minutes, and I stood at the counter with my heart doing something uncomfortable and fast, half convinced, despite everything, that somehow it wouldn't actually be there, that this whole errand would end in some new devastation instead of the recovery I'd driven here fully expecting. He came back carrying the case. I recognized it instantly, the small scuff on the corner from a fall down the porch steps 3 years earlier. The initials Lily had carefully embroidered onto the handle strap during a summer camp craft project. He set it on the counter and opened it, and there it was, untouched, exactly as it had looked the last time I'd seen it, the warm reddish wood catching the shop's fluorescent light in a way that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. Vance examined the pawn ticket Ron produced alongside it. "Signed by a Brenda Whitfield," he confirmed, checking it against the ID copy stapled to the file. "Thumbprint on record per your shop's standard intake procedure." "Everything by the book on our end," Ron said a little defensively. "We had no way of knowing it wasn't hers to sell. She had ID, she signed the form." "Understood," Vance said. "This isn't about your shop's liability. We're documenting the chain for the theft case against her." I paid the redemption balance right there at the counter, $1,200, the full amount needed to release the item immediately rather than wait out any additional processing. Cash and card both accepted, and I used the card without a second's hesitation. Whatever it cost to get that violin out of that building in the next 5 minutes was worth paying twice over. Ron printed the receipt. Vance logged the transaction details into his own report, photographing the pawn ticket, the redemption receipt, the case itself, building what he called, almost offhandedly, a pretty airtight paper trail as he worked. "This should be more than sufficient for charges," he told me once we were back out on the sidewalk, the case now in my own hands. weighing exactly as much as I remembered it weighing the last time I'd carried it. Grand larceny, given the appraised value. We'll follow up formally, but I'd recommend keeping all of this documentation together, receipts, the police report number, everything in case this moves toward prosecution or your family decides to handle restitution privately first. Thank you, I said, and I meant it more than the words probably conveyed, for taking this seriously. Ma'am, someone stole a 10-year-old's inheritance to fund a beach trip. There wasn't a version of this I wasn't going to take seriously. I drove home with the case belted into the passenger seat like it was precious cargo, because it was. And I walked through the front door to find Lily still curled up on her bed, quieter now, worn down from crying, staring blankly at the wall in the specific, hollowed-out way exhausted children stare when they've run out of tears but not out of grief. She looked up when I opened her door. I don't think I said anything at first. I just crossed the room and set the case down on the bed in front of her. It took her a second to understand what she was looking at. Then her whole face broke open, and she scrambled up onto her knees, hands flying to the latches with a kind of desperate, careful urgency. And when she lifted the lid and saw the violin sitting there exactly as it had always sat, she made a sound I don't think I'll ever forget, something between a sob and a laugh, pure relief with no complicated feelings attached to it yet. The uncomplicated joy of a child getting back something she genuinely believed was gone forever. I held her while she cried into my shoulder, one hand still resting protectively on the open case beside us. And for a few minutes I let myself just be present in that relief with her, before the part of me that still had unfinished business downstairs started quietly reasserting itself. Because the violin was home, but Brenda was still sitting in my living room, and Mark still needed to understand, in terms too clear to misinterpret, exactly what his mother's afternoon had actually cost. I found them exactly where I'd left them an hour and a half earlier, Mark on the couch, Brenda in the armchair by the window, both of them wearing the particular stillness of people who'd spent the intervening time arguing quietly about how bad this was actually going to get, and hadn't landed on an answer they liked. I set the folder down on the coffee table and pulled out the two pieces of paper that mattered most, sliding them across the glass until they came to rest near Mark's coffee cup, which had gone cold and untouched since I'd left. The redemption receipt, $1,200 paid in full, my signature at the bottom. The police incident report, grand larceny, case number stamped in the corner. Brenda's eyes moved from the papers to my face and back again, and I watched, with something that felt almost clinical in its detachment, the exact moment she understood this wasn't going to blow over the way every previous incident had blown over. "You called the police," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was no irritation in her voice, just something closer to fear. "I filed a report for grand larceny," I said, "because that's what happened. You stole a documented, appraised, legally bequeathed heirloom from a minor and sold it for cash. Officer Vance has your signature, your thumbprint, and the full paper trail. He was very clear that this qualifies as a felony given the appraised value. It was a family matter. It stopped being a family matter the moment you walked into my daughter's room and took something that was never yours to touch." I turned to Mark before she could get any further. "You have 24 hours to reimburse my personal account the full $1,200 it cost me to buy back my own daughter's inheritance from a stranger behind a counter. $1,200, we don't just have that lying around, you know that. You have savings, Mark. I've seen the account. You'll find it, the same way I found it standing at that pawn counter an hour ago, because I wasn't willing to wait around for you or your mother to decide this mattered enough to fix." He looked for a moment like he was going to argue the number, or the timeline, or the general unfairness of being handed a bill for a decision he hadn't personally made. I watched him decide, visibly, not to. "And if I don't pay it back," he said instead, quieter, "what happens to her? Then the report moves forward exactly as filed, and your mother explains the transaction to a detective instead of to me. That part isn't actually up to you, Mark. It was never going to be up to you. The only thing you get to decide is whether this stays a private, reimbursed matter between us, or whether it becomes your mother's criminal record. I'd think carefully before you decide that's not worth $1,200. Brenda started to say something else, some fresh attempt at the same tired argument about Tyler's stress, about a little girl not needing an expensive antique, about me being dramatic over a fiddle, and I held up a hand before she could finish. And something in the gesture must have carried enough finality that she actually stopped. "I'm not interested in hearing it again," I said. "You had your chance to explain yourself in my kitchen this afternoon. You didn't apologize, you didn't even pretend to feel bad. You told me my daughter didn't need her inheritance as much as your adult son needed a beach vacation." I let that sit in the room for a second before I continued. "So here's the only thing that matters now. If you ever set foot on this property again, I will call the police, and this time it won't be a report about a pawn shop. It'll be trespassing on top of everything already on file. You are not welcome in this house. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not for anything. That's not a punishment I'm choosing lightly. It's the only boundary that's ever actually worked on you." Nobody argued with that either. Mark paid the $1,200 into my account the following afternoon, drained almost entirely from a personal savings account I hadn't known the balance of until I saw the transfer confirmation, apparently enough to make paying it back sting in exactly the way I'd wanted it to. Tyler's beach trip, from what I heard secondhand through a cousin who still spoke to that side of the family, fell apart within days once Brenda called him demanding he help cover part of the emergency. Panic rippling backward through a family that had built an entire economy on the assumption that someone, somewhere, would always quietly absorb the cost of Tyler's needs. He came home 3 days early, according to that same cousin, humiliated in front of friends who'd apparently had no idea any of this was happening behind the scenes. Brenda hasn't been back to the house since. I upgraded the doorbell camera and the exterior locks that same week. Not because I expected her to actually try showing up, but because peace of mind at that point felt like something worth paying for outright rather than hoping for. Lily's violin sits back in its case on the shelf in her closet these days, exactly where it belongs, and most evenings around 6 I hear her start practicing through the wall, scales first, patient and repetitive, then whatever piece she's working through that week. Something a little more ambitious every month as her teacher pushes her further. I stood outside her door a few nights ago, just listening, the way I sometimes do now without meaning to interrupt her. She was working through something slow, something that reminded me, not for the first time, of the piece her grandmother had played at my wedding all those years ago. Unshowy, warm, the kind of music that doesn't need an audience to mean something. I didn't go in. I just stood there in the hallway and let myself listen for a while, knowing, with a certainty that had cost more than $1,200 to earn, that nobody was ever going to walk into that room and take this away from her again.